And the winner is Balatro.
And the winner is Balatro. And the winner is Balatro. And the winner is Balatro.
Balatro is pretty good. I don't know. It's a perfectly robust roguelike deck builder. If you're a fan of the genre and you've not played it, well, based on sales data, it's improbable that you exist, but if you do, then you should consider checking it out. But I think it's dramatically overrated, both in terms of its popularity and its critical reception. I think the disconnect between Balatro as it exists in reality, a charming but modestly scoped game, fairly derivative with some significant flaws, and Balatro as it exists commercially and critically, is this industry-dominating titan. A new high watermark for video game quality is fascinating. And it's this extraordinary gap that I'd like to talk about in this video. Why is this overhype happening, and why does it matter? My story with Balatro started out pretty similarly to many of you, I imagine. I first heard about it being a real winner out of Steam Next Fest, as a hot new indie game with an increasing amount of buzz around it. All I could pick up from the online conversation around it was that it was a deck-building roguelike with a poker theme. I'm an absolute sucker for roguelikes, and roguelike deck builders in particular. Slay the Spire single-handedly robbed me of so much of my life that I should probably resent it more than I do. I mean, look at that. Think of what I could have accomplished instead. Anyway, my ears naturally perked up at the word of a good new one on the scene. Screenshots and GIFs I saw posted weren't really selling it. Balatro is very game that comes free with Windows coded aesthetically. But it was hardly expensive, and so on one inauspicious evening after work, I dived in. And I had a good time. It was far from my most memorable gaming experience of 2024, but definitely solid. Learning its systems, how to squeeze the most out of them was satisfying, as was unlocking new cards and decks. Finding neat combos and pulling off some wins was enjoyable. Basically, it ticked a lot of the standard roguelike boxes in an unflashy but pleasing enough way. There was no big hook or unique twist beyond its clever poker theming to make it super memorable, but it got an easily enjoyable 20 plus hours of fun out of me. A perfectly pleasant, good not great, feeling an 8 out of 10 on this one chief type experience. I started to cool on the game, but not in an unusual or notable way. There were problems I had with it, which we'll talk about later, but after getting most of the unlocks and a handful of gold stake wins, Balatro's hardest conventional difficulty, I just felt like I'd seen most of what it had to offer. But again, I was not at all salty. I'd more than got my money's worth and mostly enjoyed my time. Not the sort of experience that made me want to talk about or recommend it especially, but one I was happy enough I'd had. I uninstalled it and moved on with my life. Balatro though. Balatro was just getting started. It kept on growing and growing and growing. I kept on seeing more and more buzz about it, more and more content flooding into my various feeds, more and more fawning over it in forums and blogs. Its developer, Local Funk, ascended to being one of those online figures whose every tweet was a news story. And it wasn't just social media noise, but critics too. It reviewed incredibly well from the outset, but then came the awards. Best Indie Game at the Golden Joysticks, Best Indie at the Game Awards, as well as winning and being nominated for so much more besides. The point when it became completely unignorable to me was when I was lucky enough to attend GDC, the same venue where the prestigious Game Developer Choice Awards were announced. A place where Balatro was about to cement itself as one of the most critically renowned games of all time. Best Debut? Balatro. Innovation Award? Balatro. Best Design? Balatro. Game of the mother-flipping year? Balatro. And it just did not make sense to me. And look, I admittedly have some contrarian tendencies, but normally I can at least understand why a piece of art is universally praised, even if I don't personally agree. But in Balatro's case, the gap between the game in my memory and the game being celebrated on stage was like a nonsensical chasm. In some ways it was cool, I guess. I love an underdog story, and Balatro, as a debut title from a mostly solo developer who only planned the game as a portfolio piece, is certainly that. Seeing it topple massive AAA releases in terms of critical reception and popularity was enjoyable, as was some of the fanboy salt online. Its mysterious developer, Local Funk, is an easy person to support. Humble, funny, and someone who, despite being obviously overwhelmed by their success, clearly wants to use their platform for good, especially by giving fellow indie devs the exposure they so often struggle to get. Incidentally, they also say they would have given Balatro an 8 out of 10, so we agree on that too. It also felt like the kind of win that could be good for the industry as a whole. If Balatro's success means that a few AAA studios internalise the lesson that you don't need to work hundreds of artists and developers half to death to make good art, then this would undeniably be a win. But I still could not stop thinking about the disconnect between the game I experienced and the conversation around it. Could it be that it's just not for me? It seemed hard to imagine. I love poker, I love deck builders, I should be the perfect audience. Was it just the naturally snowbally nature of getting attention online? I mean, algorithmic traffic is a factor in any successful project these days. All of us making stuff for online audiences must all pray that the algorithm's beneficence will shine down upon us. But it did not look like that was any more relevant for Balatro than anyone else. It's a single player game, so there's no incentive to get it just because your pestering friends did. This was also not a one-off flash in the pan, viral for a weekend and forgotten soon after kind of hit. Balatro grew, and grew steadily over a year. It's still growing as I speak. The level of long-term engagement evident in the content being created around it suggests a deep, long-term fandom, not a brief fascination. Was it that Local Thunk had just made perfect awards bait? In the film world, it's well known that if you're desperate for an Oscar, you should probably make a film about the film industry itself, because that's something that everyone on the committee will definitely care about. Or alternatively, a film about racism that doesn't make white audiences too uncomfortable, that sort of thing. Well, in the game industry, I don't think we have as clear an idea of what constitutes awards bait, but to the extent that one exists, Balatro doesn't seem to fit the bill. It has no weighty themes or plot. Its aesthetic is pleasing but functional, not especially artsy. In short, it's not going to impress folk who still need to be persuaded that games can be art. It's solely focused on delivering the pleasure of making big numbers with poker cards in a fairly unflashy way. So then, why? Why was this one of the biggest and most important games of not just last year, but arguably the whole decade so far? What am I missing? Well, I've now spoken to a lot of people, read a lot of reviews, and conversation about the game. I've played a bunch more of it, and I've thought about it far, far more than is healthy. And I think I'm inching closer to figuring it out. We will get to my theories on Balatro's popularity in a bit, but before we can talk about it, we first need to explain the game itself and why I see it as undeserving of the praise it's got. If you're a Balatro superfan, I hope you'll consider hearing me out. If you've never heard of the game, well, then firstly, I'm glad you recovered from your coma, but secondly, I hope this will make some kind of sense. And if you already think Balatro is a bit mid, then hopefully this is your time to bask in the validation of having someone else say your own opinion back at you. So what even is Balatro? Let's start by speedrunning some basics. Start the clock. Balatro is a run-based game in which your goal is to battle through a series of encounters with a standard 52-card playing deck. To beat each encounter, you need to achieve a certain score by playing poker-style hands of cards, flushes, straights, and so on, from the cards which you draw from your deck. After each encounter, you have a visit to the shop where you can buy upgrades for your deck, such as new cards, buff to cards you already have, or the power of certain hands, and most importantly, joker cards, from which most decks can only have 5 of, but which have a massive impact on the score you'll get from certain hands and how your deck plays. Your goal is to beat ante-8, which means 8 rounds of beating 2 normal encounters and 1 boss encounter, with each round requiring increasingly high scores. Through playing the game, you unlock new cards, deck types, and increasingly challenging game modes. Stop the clock! Phew. Now, if you've played other deck-building roguelikes, and if I wasn't speaking too fast, this might all sound pretty familiar. Swap out all of the poker terminology with something a bit more generic, and we could be describing any number of games in the genre. There are undeniably things that set it apart though, apart from its obvious poker theming, and many of these things I do like. Presentationally, it's a very robust package. The UI is pleasing to look at, but also easy to navigate, which is pretty critical for a game that is almost entirely UI. Personally, I would have had a bit more juice and reaction from the game, especially when you're really breaking the game over your knee and making some absurdly big numbers, but that's more a matter of personal taste. In fact, the relatively subdued amount of feedback arguably fits the game's tone quite well. It's clearly going for a very laid-back and easygoing vibe, as made clear with its cozy retro visuals, and especially its mellow, ever-looping score, which also makes for a nice change of pace from the more frenetic and high-stakes feeling roguelikes. There's a bit of Balatro's design that I especially love, which I genuinely think is very innovative, which is how much it lets you and actively encourages you to mix up your build mid-run. It's a common problem in roguelikes that you're either pushed into committing to a certain playstyle as early as possible, which makes the later of the portions of the game have less interesting decisions to make, or they encourage a kind of upgrade soup in which the impact of any individual power-up can get a bit lost among the pile that you already have. Balatro really solves this, however. Your jokers are the most defining element of your deck, but you are very limited in how many you can have. But it's more than possible to swap out some or all of them in between encounters, so long as you have the cash to spare for new ones. In fact, you're all but forced to do this to consistently achieve good runs. Some jokers are solid for the early game, but really fall off late game, and vice versa. This makes runs feel much more dynamic than many other genre peers, because you can consistently be on the lookout for options to transform your strategy, even well into late game. And nailing a transition to a new build feels fantastic, like doing a perfect gear change while trying to accelerate a car as fast as possible. Balatro is also a prime example of innovation through reduction, finding new and exciting game forms by removing elements that are normally genre staples. In the same way that Zaum made the modern classic Disco Elysium by completely removing combat from the conventional CRPG formula. Or in the way Dear Esther basically invented the walking simulator genre by removing the shooting from a first-person shooter. Or in the way that Limbo sucked all of the joy and colour out of platformers and added a whole lot of nightmare fuel to give us the once thriving subgenre of miserable indie platformer. Balatro somewhat does the same with deck builders, albeit a bit less radically. So many of the norms of the genre have been pointedly stripped out of it. There is no map to choose encounters from, everything is wholly linear. There is no story, no world building, no setting at all. There are no enemies to learn the moves of, only numbers to exceed. Even the boss encounters have been stripped down to a minimalistic form, consisting only of a single impactful modifier on normal play, and that's it. In fact, Balatro is so stripped down that you might think there is not much to find fault with, but sadly, you'd be wrong. I actually think Balatro has a bunch of design issues that hold it back. That's right folks, we're at the nitpicking, good thing bad actually section of the review. Let's start with Balatro's core gameplay, the bit where you play cards. Initially, the lack of enemies or any kind of opposing force beyond a score to exceed feels quite fresh, but what it means in practice is your desired play pattern is never disrupted. The only mild variation is the randomness of what cards you'll draw, but you're also given lots of tools to mitigate this. No matter what kind of strategy your deck is built around, encounters typically become a repetitive loop of discarding over and over again, until you find your perfect hand. You play it, repeat. I didn't get to the point of pettiness of actually counting, but it feels like over half the number of clicks I do in a typical Balatro run are just selecting cards to discard. In fact, maybe I am that petty. 1 second. Okay, no, that was too crushingly dull even for me. But I made it to the first 100 clicks of a recent run, and not counting the ones that were not gameplay meaningful, 54 were either selecting cards to discard or discarding them. So yeah, actually over half. Boss encounters are there to try and mix things up, but they are a bizarre bunch. In practice, the majority of boss modifiers are either completely ignorable for your deck, debuffing a card type that you don't use or doing something else irrelevant, or they are a complete roadblock, a run ender that you can only avoid by getting lucky or finding one of the few items that lets you change or avoid bosses. The shop you visit between encounters presents you more consistently with interesting choices, but here there are still issues. Lots of the purchases are either obviously good or bad for a given situation, and do not therefore feel all that interesting. This feels especially true on higher difficulty stakes, which introduce jokers that are either destroyed after a few rounds, unremovable, or which tax you for owning them. Interesting in theory, but in practice it just increases the number of terrible non-choices you're offered. Especially late game, most of what you do in shops will just be spamming the reroll option, trying to find something relevant. I also found its runs surprisingly repetitive, but this is probably hard to explain if you're not already a Balatro player. How can a game with as much variance as Balatro, from its 150 jokers to its completely randomised shops, feel repetitive? I'll try and explain. So your goal in Balatro is to make a big number, but your big numbers are actually the product of two smaller numbers, your chips and your malt, which are produced by the hands you play and whatever jokers you've got along for the ride. Most ways of increasing these numbers add flat increases, but malt also has options for non-linear increases in the form of multipliers, or X-malts. like the Humble Acrobat, which multiplies your mult by 3 just for the last hand of the encounter. The thing is though, linear increases only really cut it in the early game. To complete a run and make it anti-8, you're basically going to need a source or two of X mults to make it. But these X mults are just not very useful in the early game when your mult scores are low and when you're less likely to have the means to activate them anyway. What this means in practice is that every run feels quite repetitive in its high-level flow and goals. Every run starts by looking through a source of mult or chips to get you through the first few encounters, doesn't really matter which. By mid-game, you'll be on the hunt for mult and chip jokers that scale well. By endgame, you'll be looking to sell off your weaker, flat sources in favour of more X-mult jokers, and hopefully getting over the line. You'll get successful ones that don't conform to this template, but for the majority of runs, this is the pattern, over and over again. I checked some Balatro guides just to make sure this wasn't a strange meta unique to me, but sure enough, this way of structuring a run seems like standard beginner's advice you'll see in one form or another posted everywhere. Not just because it works, but because it's basically what you're forced to do by the game's design. 150 jokers sounds like a lot, but only a handful are actually relevant to you at any given point in the game. And in this way, what appears at first like an exciting, wide-open possibility space starts to feel very constrained and repetitive. In procedural content generation research, we call this the oatmeal problem. Things that are technically unique, like a bowl of oatmeal, still seeming very similar and repetitive when viewed collectively alongside a bunch of other bowls. I could keep on going with increasingly niche nitpicks and critiques, but this video is long enough and I think it's slightly beside the point. In short, I do not think Balatro is great at presenting the player with interesting choices. Only a fraction of the choices you make in a run feel important. Which would be okay, there's nothing wrong with obvious choices in games. There are plenty of great games with no choices at all, unless you count choosing to keep playing as a choice. The problem is, in Balatro, that is all there is. There is nothing else to focus on apart from choices and numbers going up. A one-sided crushing victory in a different roguelike could feel satisfying if given narrative context or if you remember struggling against that enemy before. A loss can be given meaning by giving you an excuse to go on a revenge mission against the enemy who felled you. But that's never the case in Balatro because your enemy is only ever a big number, and it's really hard to develop animosity or begrudging respect towards a big number. In fact, it's hard to feel much about them at all. Those are my most memorable feelings on Balatro's design if we take it in isolation, but to fully make sense of them and why I think Balatro's reception is so bizarre, we need to look at the wider context it exists in. If you've been playing indie games for the past decade or so, odds are you've played a lot of roguelikes. If you haven't, you must have been trying to actively avoid them. In the AAA space, the 2010s might have been ruled by open-world sandboxes spattered with pointless collectibles. But in the indie space, roguelikes were king. Sure, arty platformers often put up a good fight, but they never presented a real threat to roguelike hegemony. I play a lot of games, including indie games, but I'm not exactly a hipster crate digger. I tend to play stuff that has a good amount of popular buzz around it, and even so, I've played a crazily diverse range of roguelikes in my time. I've rogueliked in endless caves, eldritch seas, and office blocks. I've escaped the hells, explored cells, and fallen down wells. I've enjoyed everything from dungeon crawlers to violent brawlers and climbing up wallers. If you named a combination of game genre and setting, I've probably played a roguelike that would match the description. And again, I've only played the tiniest fraction of what's out there. By rough estimate based on Steam tags, around 2 new ones are added to Steam every day. Even if we just look at deck building roguelikes, a niche within a niche, there are still over 1,000 of them listed on Steam alone. If we step out into the wider world and look at places like itch.io, it gets even more overwhelming. You would think, wouldn't you, that a new one would have to do quite a lot to stand out. And yet, Balatro. Its incredible popularity, despite its lack of originality, is not exactly unprecedented. New titles which are a refinement of an already popular title or formula are often rewarded with massive popularity. Just look at everyone who jumped on the Battle Royale formula and was rewarded for their cynical trend riding with huge piles of money. But these titles generally aren't critical darlings too. In fact, repeating successful formulas or artists is generally a formula for getting mocked in other artistic disciplines. And yet, Balatro. This disconnect was really hammered home for me by a recent gaming experience I had playing another deck-building roguelike called Inscryption. Now, we're not going to go into any great depth on Inscryption. Suffice to say it was released in 2021, 3 years before Balatro saw the light of day and started to take over the world. In many ways, it features similar gameplay to Balatro. You start with a deck of cards, moving through an abstract world to add to and upgrade this deck so you can use it to survive encounters and defeat bosses. But while Balatro basically begins and ends here, for Inscryption, this is just the beginning. In the world of Inscryption, you're not playing this deck builder to have fun. You're playing it to survive. You're playing it because you're being compelled to by this shadowy and malevolent figure across the table from you. And this isn't just some fun lore, some easy to ignore fluff in the background while you focus on cards and numbers. No, at any point you can pause the game and get up from the table, explore the cabin of your kidnapper. He might be a monster, but he's not inconsiderate. You can always stretch your legs. You might even find hints as to what's happening to you, and maybe even a way to escape. And you're going to want to escape, because if you lose this roguelike, well, let's just say you're not getting kicked back to the main menu. And this is just what's revealed in the first 15 or so minutes of play. There is so much interesting stuff happening in Inscryption to the point that I don't even want to show you any gameplay past the first few hours because it would be such a spoiler to do so. Now my point is not that Inscryption is a better game than Balatro. Despite them both superficially being deck-building roguelikes, they are actually radically different games with different goals. I personally much prefer Inscryption, but that's a matter of taste rather than any kind of objective quality. Nor is my point that Inscryption went criminally underappreciated compared to Balatro. Inscryption actually received plenty of awards and plaudits back in its day. It might not have enjoyed Balatro's meteoric success, but it still did incredibly well. In fact, it won the very Game of the Year award at GDC that Balatro won a few years later. Instead, my point is that 4 years ago, we had this renowned game that revolutionised and subverted the very concept of a deck-building roguelike, that used the form to tell and deliver a wholly unique kind of story and experience with standout writing, visuals and so much more I don't want to spoil, while still being a completely robust and engaging iteration of the genre. So having Balatro come along, which brings so little new to the table while also receiving levels of hype and praise that are almost unheard of, well, it's just a bit baffling. So how to understand the Balatro phenomena then? When I started thinking about this video, I naturally started by playing a bunch more of it to see if anything made itself clearer, but nope. It was just as I remembered. A perfectly solid roguelike with a few cool aspects and a bunch of minor irritations. I had slightly more fun than I expected because I had been in hater mode for so long, but nowhere near enough to revise my opinion. And look, you might well disagree. Maybe you're hopping into the comments to tell me so, but if you are, you might want to hold off for a second because it's now time for a full section almost entirely focused on the positive opinions everyone else seems to have on this game. It's time for a dive into Balatro's reviews. What better way, I thought, of understanding why everyone loves this game than by reading what they've said about it? Pretty obvious place to start, right? Sadly though, neither the critic reviews nor those from regular users were really illuminating in the slightest. All they did was make me more confused, if anything, and made me feel a bit bad about making this video. I started out with the critic reviews, taking the first dozen or so of the most positive English language ones from Metacritic. The first takeaway was, boy oh boy, the standards for writing and video game reviews are low these days, if this sample is anything to go by. A good chunk of them spent 90% of their word count just describing Balatro's gameplay in a way that I reckon would be indecipherable if you hadn't played the game before, but whatever. In terms of shedding light on the near perfect scores Balatro was getting, they just weren't all that helpful. I made a spreadsheet to keep track of what points got praised. Again, so much of the reviews were useless fluff, which meant surprisingly few actual points were actually made, but some trends did shine through. Almost every review mentioned the diversity of runs and strategies as a strong suit, with a healthy smattering of positive comments on the UI design, the juiciness of interactions. Reviewers were also positive about how easy it was to learn. In fact, this was the second most frequent point of praise. There was nothing that dealt with my critiques of the game, apart from a few who also complained about the bosses, and no fresh angles on the game either. The positive user reviews, or at least the 100 or so I went through on Steam, were even more homogenous in their view. Why is Balatro good, I ask? Because it's so addictive, everyone replies. Addictive, 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 addictive. Well, that's not entirely fair. There were some more nuanced takes out there praising similar stuff to the better critic reviews. Its simplicity, its UI, run diversity, and so on. There were also a surprising number of people getting overcome with nostalgia for a simpler time in gaming. People for whom Balatro clearly represented a path back to a more enjoyable time in their lives. Not loads, but enough that I started to feel a bit bad about making this video. I mean, here's Adherzan being transported back to their childhood like the villain at the end of Ratatouille. And while I'm just staring on bemused, writing an essay about how mid this game is, how could I not feel a bit bad? But did any of this background reading even help me make my video? No, not really at all. I was hoping I would get people praising stuff that did not work for me, or maybe pointing out brilliant aspects of Balatro that I hadn't even considered. But nope. Everyone was either responding to the things that I agreed were solid, but not in my opinion any way notable enough to justify high praise, like it being easy to learn, having good clean UI and so on, or they were just telling me over and over again how addictive the game was. Which is obviously unhelpful because it doesn't articulate why, and it's also basically the defining word folks use to describe any roguelike they like. Is this really any more addictive than the hundreds of other roguelikes that have sucked in massive audiences? So if reviews weren't any help in understanding the Balatro phenomenon, then what would help? I was starting to run out of ideas. The reality of the game itself hadn't helped, nor the context it existed in, nor what people were actually saying about it. Well, if the facts could not help us here at all, maybe it was time for some theorizing. Now we get to the part of the video that I teased right from the off, my theories to explain the massive discrepancy between the Balatro hype and Balatro's actual quality. I hope I didn't get your hopes up, because these theories are a bit straightforward and dull. As you'll see, I'm not alleging foul play or anything remotely nefarious. Nothing so interesting as that. I think there are actually some much more banal and straightforward reasons, which at least partly explain Balatro's hype, which are unrelated to its actual quality as a game. I have organised my theories into an internet-friendly numbered list to hopefully make them marginally more compelling. Let me know if it works. Theory 1. Roguelikes are an underserved genre. If you're an indie games fan, then you might think this take is insane. As I referenced earlier in this overlong, salty rant disguised as a video essay, we've been drowning in indie roguelikes for well over a decade. But I think this theory has weight behind it, and it goes some way to explaining Balatro's popularity. The very fact that the roguelike trend is not slowing down commercially despite the market flood, Balatro was one of its biggest hits ever, tells us that a substantial market still exists, and it's one we've not found the ceiling on yet. With other gaming trends, we've seen similar patterns. A surprise hit, often from an independent developer, pioneers a new genre or gameplay formula. Then come the imitators, or rip-offs if you're feeling less charitable. Mostly from indie developers, but also from the AAA space if the hit was big enough. All hoping to grab a slice of the pie that everyone's attention has now been drawn to. Assuming it wasn't a total fluke, the first few make money, but more and more players pile in until the market is saturated. Appetite for new versions of that particular thing is sated, and everyone moves on. We've seen this in recent years with hero shooters, battle royale games, and, as highlighted by Frost in a recent video, it looks like extraction shooters are next. With roguelikes though, we've not really seen this happen in the same way. Firstly, because no matter how many folks are flooding in, it doesn't seem to be meaningfully slowing. New titles are abundant, and every year another few make serious money. But also, because we've not seen much interest from AAA developers, despite all the money sloshing around. There are a couple of semi-exceptions, a roguelike adjacent game here, a roguelike DLC mode there, but it's been relatively slim pickings. This is especially strange in the case of deck builders because they seem so perfect for current trends in general media consumption. They play well on mobile, which is good because mobile gaming is basically half the market currently. They are good second screen content due to being turn-based, good for streaming because your audience can easily debate and get invested in your choices, and so on and so on. Why AAA studios and the money people haven't jumped in on this long-standing trend is a topic for another video, though I suspect it is to do with difficulties around monetization. But the fact is, they haven't, so it's been left to the indies to try and capture it. But obviously they do not have the marketing budget to easily gain attention, especially attention outside of the bubble of folks who are already paying attention to the indie scene. What I think this means is we have a genre with a large potential player base that major developers are uninterested in catering to, and that small developers struggle to reach. Meaning that when a sufficiently polished title finally gets enough word-of-mouth momentum to escape indie containment into more mainstream gaming spheres, it's going to find a mass audience who are desperate for that kind of gaming experience, without ever having known to seek it out. It's purely anecdotal, but I've seen this play out in my own life. I know multiple people who picked up Balatro due to its hype, for whom it was their first roguelike, and I hardly know anyone. Theory 2. Roguelikes are perfect for awards committees. Theory 1 helps to explain Balatro's extraordinary popularity, but it does not explain its critical reception and the intimidatingly large pile of awards it's accumulating. Well, it partly does. Awards shows are naturally going to be popularity contests to an extent. There are far too many games coming out every day for everyone to get a fair shake, so having some popular momentum behind you will at least get you on critics' radars. But that only goes some of the way to explaining it. Not every viral hit is loved by critics. No, my second theory is that roguelikes were actually the perfect awards bait the whole time. At the same GDC that Balatro won all those awards, I got to speak to a few of the folks who sit on the panels that vote on these award winners, and something that came up over and over again was how time poor these people are. They are obviously not going to be rolling credits on every game on every shortlist they're voting on. Even for the most work-shy student, this would be a tough ask every year. Naturally, this means a lot of judgments behind award-winning games are made in very short time periods, sampling only the opening stretches of them. One senior guy I spoke to stated that his voting approach was that he simply voted for games that he still wanted to play after the first half hour, even though he probably wouldn't touch them again. And what genre of game is not harmed at all by being played for only a few short bursts? I mean, there are a few options, I guess, but roguelikes have to be one of the really obvious ones. Even if you only give Balatro half an hour, that's likely enough for a first full run and to be intrigued by what you could do in the next one. But it's also enough time for you to have seen most of the main gameplay and be somewhat confident in your choice. For many meatier AAA games, that would hardly be enough time to get through the opening cutscenes. This is obviously a bit tenuous as a theory, but if we look at the last 5 years of the Game Developers' Choice Awards, 3 of the 5 grand prizes have been given to roguelikes. Not really enough data to claim there's a trend, but take a look at the other game awards out there and see how much roguelike representation there is, despite them having a fraction of the funding that is going to AAA genres. I really think there is something to them being a good genre for awards committees. Theory 3. Balatro's poker theming simplifies onboarding. Theory 3 is not really a theory, it's clearly true to an extent. The only thing that could be debated is how important it was to Balatro's success. This was the second most popular point made by critics, and I saw it over and over again in user reviews. The point being that Balatro's poker theming was truly ingenious in how it smoothed the initial learning process for the game. All games have learning curves, and almost all of them have a steep part right at the beginning when you first start playing a new title. This will obviously vary a lot player to player. A heavily experienced FPS player will naturally have an easier time learning a new one than someone who's never tried to navigate in first person before. That bump is always there though, and it's naturally a time that lots of players will decide a game is not for them if the bump is too steep, or if the reward for getting over it is not obvious. I think deck builders might actually struggle with this more than other genres. They're often so abstract that it can be really hard to build a mental model of what you should be trying to do. In a normal first-person shooter, even just from a screenshot, I think your average person could summarise this will be a game about shooting bullets into enemies while trying to avoid being shot back. Deck builders can be far more opaque though, and I think this can be a major barrier for mass adoption. Onboarding is a bit of a cursed design problem in general for roguelikes, because learning what you're meant to be doing and how to master the game's systems is meant to be part of the fun. It's not meant to be fully obvious how to play well, you're meant to learn through play and failure. So how to solve this problem? How do you give players a bunch of tricky systems and synergies without initially overwhelming them? Well, for Balatro, the answer is its theming, and it does a brilliant job of overcoming this. Poker is, in the West at least, perhaps the most popular and widely played card game. It itself is also an easy-to-learn, hard-to-master type game. You can spend a lifetime getting better at poker. But learning the types of scoring a hand and how they rank against each other can be done by anyone in minutes. It's also played by everyone, not just traditional gaming or nerd hobby audiences. In other words, it's the perfect theme for a game that is aiming for mass adoption and appeal. You can get surprisingly far in Balatro just with a working knowledge of poker hands, and some random purchases from the shop. Plenty long enough for the game to get its hooks into you. The poker theming doesn't just help you learn Balatro though, having any level of poker understanding also makes so many of Balatro's basic mechanics feel much cooler and more subversive, because they feel like cheating and getting away with it. Sadly, this trick only works initially. The novelty of breaking the rules of poker wears off quickly because that's all you do in the game. There is no normal poker in Balatro to subvert. In fact, Balatro is way less poker-like than its presentation suggests. No betting, no mix of public and hidden information, and so on and so on. But the trick lasts plenty long enough to get new players over the initial hump of learning what they are meant to be doing. This is, I think, a major facet of Balatro's disproportionate success. Now, I like my theories. I do. I think they're pretty well evidenced, hopefully persuasive. But I'm also not fully satisfied with them, to be honest. I can't help but feel there's more I'm missing. The gap between what I see as Balatro's quality and the level of love it gets is so vast that I think there's more going on that I just cannot see. So many folks whose opinions I respect, including people incredibly well versed in roguelikes as a genre, seem to have no problem with the pedestal Balatro's been put on. None of my theories would really explain that. Again, this is one I'd love help from the comment section on. My theories, especially Theory 3 on Balatro's ingenious theming, also seem odd because aren't I basically talking my way into showering praise on the game? If onboarding is such a challenge in roguelikes, shouldn't we be celebrating a game that does it well? Have I in fact played myself by demonstrating what makes Balatro so impressive? Well, that's a good enough segue into our next section, a short detour into the surely uncontroversial topic of what makes art good. We're going to keep this section pretty brief, firstly because it is well-trodden ground. There are endless think pieces and video essays about the challenges and intrinsic silliness of rating video games. Can a game be too long? What about too short? How much does writing matter to a game's quality? What about the graphical fidelity? And so on and so on. All can be fun to discuss down the pub or on message boards, but the only possible answers to these kind of questions are some kind of non-committal, it depends. There is no possible right answer, and getting into fights on the internet about it is not exactly the best use of your time. However, in thinking about Balatro, I think lots of these kind of questions are unignorable. So in the interests of completeness, I think it's only fair to highlight these questions and roughly where I stand on them when it comes to this game in particular. Does a lack of originality harm a game's worthiness? Is a game less worthy of praise and attention if the majority of its best ideas and designs come from previous titles? What about scope? Should we reward games for ambition, even if it comes at the cost of consistency? Or should we reward games that only do a few things well? Or are both equally valid? Does being easy to learn increase the quality of a game? Or does being initially opaque not matter, and we should only judge games with a full understanding of what they're trying to do? Finally, does compulsive design reduce worthiness? Is it praiseworthy to form addictive loops through classic Skinner box design, or is this a separate, less worthy thing than good game design? Now, to be clear, I still think I'd be perplexed by Balatro's success, no matter the answers to these questions. Even if none of them were causing issues for me, I still think it's less good at providing interesting play than other titles in the genre. Cards on the table, though, I do have strong feelings on these questions in the context of Balatro. Its lack of originality does bother me. The creator says they actually did not play Slay the Spire before making it, but I cannot ignore that Balatro is in so many ways just a poker-themed remake of Slay the Spire. Its lack of scope bothers me, at least for a game that's been showered with this much praise. There's nothing wrong with stripped down, focused games, but there is little that's interesting or tricky about the challenges Balatro takes on. All it aims to do is to make it pleasing to click on cards and watch numbers go up, which is a challenge that dozens of other games have taken on and already succeeded at. I think you should aim for more to be a Game of the Year contender. I appreciate that it's easy to learn, and that is no mean feat, but I do not think that should carry so much weight, especially if I'm right about this being the secret behind so much of Balatro's success, critically and commercially. And finally, while I have no problem with games that use common tricks like randomized outcomes to increase their compulsiveness, if the only positive thing you can say about a game is that it's addictive, well, I think that's not a game deserving of the pedestal we are putting it on. Before we close things out, I just wanted to preempt a criticism I can imagine this video getting, which is, who cares? Even if you agree with me Balatro is a tad overrated, you might think, what does it matter? No one cares about Game Awards, and why do you care so much that some pleasant-seeming indie dev is now a millionaire? Well, if this is your opinion, I can see where you're coming from, but I earnestly think that you are wrong. I mean, you're probably not wrong about me caring too much, but I think you're wrong if you think it doesn't matter. Firstly, when it comes to Balatro's raw popularity, there is the opportunity cost of it all. People do not have infinite money or infinite time, and most people spend both wisely, or at least cautiously. When Balatro gets 1 million more sales after the Game Awards, that's 1 million sets of eyes that could be going anywhere, and they are all going to one place. This is not news to anyone that pays attention to the indie scene, but there are so many amazing games that die with almost no eyes on them. Developers who would have been able to stay solvent if they'd got the tiniest fraction of the commercial support that Balatro got. Now, this is obviously not Balatro or Local Thunk's fault, they are just one pretty sound-seeming person, and they've clearly made a game that resonates with a whole lot of people. Nor is it any player's fault for buying and enjoying the game. We are not under any obligation to play games for any other reason than wanting to. But we all do participate in a gaming ecosystem that has given local folk a level of wealth that their great-grandchildren will still be enjoying the benefits of. At the same time, hundreds of talented people are being driven out of the same industry. And hopefully we can all agree that that's at least a shame, and maybe an active problem that we could try and address. On a dorkier final note, I also think this matters because we are collectively deciding the future canon of games here. None of the various game awards have the clout of something like the Oscars just yet, but one day they might, especially if we as a community keep elevating great art. By showering Balatro in awards to this extent, we are declaring to the wider world and the future of games criticism that this was the high watermark of 2024. This is one of the peaks of what gaming could achieve. And I just do not think that is something to be done lightly, especially when to me, Balatro is far from worthy of this kind of elevation. I'm not saying to take this too seriously, there are infinitely more serious things going on even just in gaming. But if you care about games and you want to see them thrive, you should care about what we show to the world. You should care about what we hold above our shoulders as the best we have to offer. You should care that Balatro is so overrated. Phew, finally at the end. Once again I set out to make a short punchy video, and once again I utterly failed. I really enjoyed making this one though, and I hope you enjoyed watching it, even if I got a bit ranty and preachy in places. This time I'd be especially interested in your thoughts in the comments, especially if you played Balatro. Did you feel similarly to me about it, or do you think it's more than worthy of its praise? How do you explain its massive popularity? Any theories I did not consider? Regardless, thanks to you all for watching, and especially big thank you if you are a Balatro fan for hearing me out. I've got a bunch of videos in the works, mostly much less contentious than this one, and I'm really excited about them, so chuck us a thumbs up or a sub if you enjoyed this one and would like the algorithm to show you more of me in future. And until next time, take care. And if you enjoy Balatro a lot, but you're tiring of stacking red seals and losing to the plant, take a look beyond to the rest of the amazing things this genre has to offer. You might just like what you find.